Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Prize of Flight podcast. Today is of course, Halloween, so this is my Halloween special where I read a couple of Lovecraft stories, which is nice since Lovecraft writes a lot of short stories. I've only planned 3, but if there's enough people in the chat when I'm done and interest, I might read 1 or 2 more. We'll see how that turns out. The first story I have is The Doom That Came to Sarnath. There is in the land of Nar a vast still lake that is fed by no stream and out of which no stream flows. 10,000 years ago there stood by its shore the mighty city of Sarnath, where there stands no more. But Sarnath stands no more. Hold on a second. There's an error here. Oh, let's try this again. There is in the land of Nar a vast still lake that is fed by no stream and out of which no stream flows. 10,000 years ago there stood by its shore the mighty city of Sarnath, but Sarnath stands there no more. It is told that in the immemorial years when the world was young, before ever the man of Sarnath came to the land of Nar, another city stood beside the lake, the great stone city of Ib, which was old as the lake itself, and peopled with beings not pleasing to behold. Very strange, very odd and ugly were these beings, as indeed are most beings of a world yet inchoate and rudely fashioned. It is written on the brick cylinders of Cadatharon that the beings of Ib were in hue as green as the lake and the mists that rise above it, that they had bulging eyes, pouting flabby lips, and curious ears, and were without voice. It is also written that they have descended one night from the moon in a mist, they and the vast still lake and the gray stone city Ib. However this may be, it is certain that they worshipped a sea-green stone idol chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug, the great water lizard, before which they danced horribly when the moon was gibbous. And it is written in the papyrus of the Larnac that they one day discovered fire and thereafter kindled flames on many ceremonial occasions. But not much is written of these beings because they lived in very ancient times, and man is young and knows little of the very ancient living things. After many eons, man came to the land of Nar, dark shepherd folk with their fleecy flocks, who built Thra, Elarnek, and Cadatharon on the winding river Ai. And certain tribes, more hardy than the rest, pushed onto the border of the lake and built Sarnath, at a spot where precious metals were found in the earth. Not far from the gray city of Ib did the wandering tribes lay the first stones of Sarnath, and at the beings of Ib they marveled greatly. But with their marveling was mixed hate, for they thought it not meet that beings of such aspect should walk about the world of men at dusk, nor did they like the strange sculptures upon the gray monoliths of Ib, for these sculptures were terrible with great antiquity. Why the beings and the sculptures lingered so late in the world, even until the coming of men, none could tell, unless it was because the land of Nar is very still and remote from most other lands, both of waking and of dream. As the men of Sarnath beheld more of the beings of Ib, their hate grew, and it was not less because they found the beings weak and soft as jelly to the touch of stones and spears and arrows. So one day the young warriors, the slingers and the spearmen and the bowmen marched against Ib, and slew all the inhabitants thereof, pushing their queer bodies into the lake with long spears, because they did not wish to touch them. And because they did not like the gray sculpted monoliths of Ib, they cast these also into the lake, wondering from the greatness of the labor, however the stones were brought from afar, as they must have been, since there is not like them in all the land of Nar, or in the lands adjacent. Thus of the very ancient city of Ib was nothing spared, save the sea-green stone idol chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug the water lizard. This the young warriors took back with them to Sarnath as a symbol of conquest over the old gods and beings of Ib, and a sign of leadership in Nar. But on the night after it was set up in the temple, a terrible thing must have happened, for weird lights were seen over the lake. And in the morning the people found the idol gone, and the high priest Taran-ish lying dead, as from some fear unspeakable. And before he died, Taran-ish had scrawled upon the altar of the chrysolite with coarse, shaky strokes the sign of doom. After Taran-ish, there were many high priests in Sarnath, but never was the sea-green stone idol found. And many centuries came and went, wherein Sarnath prospered exceedingly, so that only priests and old women remembered what Taran-ish had scrawled upon the altar of chrysolite. Betwixt Sarnath and the city of Elarnac arose a caravan route, and the precious metals from the earth were exchanged for other metals and rare cloths and jewels and books and tools for artificers and all things of luxury that are known to the people who dwell among the wandering river Ai and beyond. So Sarnath waxed mighty and learned and beautiful and sent forth conquering armies to subdue the neighboring cities. And in time there sat upon the throne in Sarnath the kings of all the land of Nar and of many lands adjacent. The wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind was Sarnath the Magnificent. Of polished desert quarried marble were its walls, in height 300 cubits and in breadth 75, so that chariots might pass each other as men drove them along the top. For full 500 stadia did they run, being open only on the side towards the lake, where a green stone seawall kept back the waves that rose oddly once a year at the festival of the destroying of Ib. In Sarnath were 50 streets from the lake to the gates of the caravans, and 50 more intersecting them. With onyx were they paved, save those whereon the horses and camels and elephants trod, which were paved with granite. And the gates of Sarnath were as many as the landward ends of the streets, each of bronze, flanked by figures of lions and elephants carven from some stone no longer known among men. The houses of Sarnath were of glazed brick and chalcedony, each having its walled garden and crystal lakelet. With strange art were they builded, for no other city had houses like them. And travelers from Thra and Delarnic and Kadathron marveled at the shining domes wherewith they were surmounted. But more marvelous still were the palaces and temples and the gardens made by Zakar the Olden King. There were many palaces, the least of which were mightier than any in Thra or Alarnec or Kadathron. So high were they that one within might sometimes fancy himself beneath only the sky. Yet, when lighted with torches dipped in the oil of Dother, the walls shewed vast paintings of kings and armies, of a splendor at once inspiring and stupefying to the beholder. Many were the pillars of the palaces, all of tinted marble, and carven into designs of surpassing beauty. And in most of the palaces the floors were mosaics of beryl and lapis lazuli and sardonyx and carbuncle and other choice materials, so disposed that the beholder might fancy himself walking over beds of the rarest flowers. And they were likewise fountains which cast scented waters about in pleasing jets arranged with cunning art. Outshining all others were the palace of the kings of Manar and of the lands adjacent. On a pair of golden crouching lions rested the throne, many steps above the gleaming floor, and it was wrought of one piece of ivory, though no man lives who knows when such a great piece could have come. In that place there were also many galleries and many amphitheaters, where lions and men and elephants battled at the pleasure of the kings. Sometimes the amphitheaters were flooded with water, conveyed from the lake in mighty aqueducts, and then were enacted stirring sea fights or combats betwixt swimmers and deadly marine things. Lofty and amazing were the 17 tower-like temples of Sarnath, fashioned of bright multicolored stone not known elsewhere. All full 1,000 cubits high stood the greatest among them, wherein the high priest dwelt with a magnificence scarce less than that of the kings. On the ground were halls as vast and splendid as those of the palaces, were gathered throngs in worship of Zokalar and Tamash and Loban, the chief gods of Sarnath, whose incense enveloped shrines were as the throne of monarchs. Not like the icons of other gods were those of Zokalar and Tamash and Loban, for so close to life were they that one might swear the graceful bearded gods themselves sat on the ivory thrones. And upon unending steps of shining zircon was the tower chamber wherefrom the high priest looked out over the city and the plains and the lake by day, and at the cryptic moon and significant stars and planets and their reflections on the lake by night. Here was done the very secret and ancient rite in detestation of Bakrug the water lizard, and here rested the altar of chrysolite, which bore the doom scroll of Taran Ish. Wonderful likewise were the gardens made by Zokhar the Olden King. In the center of Sarnath they lay, covering a great space and encircled by a high wall, and they were surmounted by a mighty dome of glass, through which shone the sun and moon and stars and planets when it was clear, and from which there hung fulgent lights of the sun and moon and stars and planets when it was not clear. In summer, the gardens were cooled with fresh, odorous breezes skillfully wafted by fans, and in winter, they were heated with concealed fires, so that in those gardens it was always spring. There ran little streams over bright pebbles, dividing meads of green and gardens of many hues, and spanned by a multitude of bridges. Many were the waterfalls in their courses, and many were the lilied lakelets into which they expanded. Over the streams and lakelets rode white swans, whilst the music of rare birds chimed in with the melody of the waters. In ordered terraces rose the garden banks, adorned here and there with bowers of vines and sweet blossoms, and seats and benches of marble and porphyry, and there were many small shrines and temples where one might rest or pray to the small gods. Each year there was celebrated in Sarnath the feast of the destroying of Ib, at which time wine, song, dancing, and merriment of every kind abounded. Great honors were then paid to the shades of those who had annihilated the odd ancient beings. And the memory of those beings and of their elder gods were derided by dancers and lutanists crowned with roses from the gardens of Zokhar. And the kings would look out over the lake and curse the bones of the dead that lay beneath it. At first the high priests liked not these festivals, for there had descended amongst them queer tales of how the sea-green icon had vanished, and how Taran Ish had died from fear and left a warning. And they said that from their high tower they sometimes saw lights beneath the waters of the lake. But as many years passed without calamity, even the priests laughed and cursed and joined in the orgies of the feasters. Indeed, had they not themselves in their high tower often performed the very ancient and secret rite and desecration of Bakrug, the water lizard, and 1,000 years of riches and delight passed over Sarnath, wonder of the world and pride of all mankind? Gorgeous beyond thought was the feast of the 1,000th year of destroying of Ib. For a decade had it been talked of in the land of Nar, and as it drew nigh, there came to Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants, men from Thra, Elarnak, and Kadathron, and all the cities of Manar and the lands beyond. Before the marble walls on the appointed night were pitched the pavilions of princes and the tents of travelers, and all the shore resounded with song of happy revelers. Within the banquet hall reclined Nargis High, the king, drunken with ancient wine from the vaults of conquered Nath, and surrounded by feasting nobles and hurrying slaves. There were eaten many strange delicacies at the feast, peacocks from the isles of Nariel in the middle ocean, young goats from the distant hills of Implon, heels of camels from the Nazik desert, nuts and spices from Kadathrian groves, and pearls from wave-washed metal dissolved in the vinegar of Thra. Of sauces, there were an untold number prepared by the subtlest cooks in Almanar and suited to the palate of every feaster. But most prized of all the viands were the great fishes from the lake, each of vast size and served up on golden platters set with rubies and diamonds. Whilst the king and his nobles feasted within the palace and viewed the crowning dish as it awaited them on golden platters, others feasted elsewhere. In the tower of the great temple, the priests held revels, and in pavilions without the wall, the princes of neighboring lands made merry. And it was high priest Nai Ka who first saw the shadows that descended from the gibbous moon into the lake, and the damnable green mists that arose from the lake to meet the moon, and to shroud in a sinister haze the towers and domes of fated Sarnath. Thereafter those in the towers and without the walls beheld strange lights on the water, and saw the gray rock Akurion, which was wont to rear high above it near the shore, was almost submerged. And fear grew greatly yet swiftly, so that the princes of Alarnak and of Far Rokol took down and folded their tents and pavilions and departed for the river Ai, though they scarcely knew the reason for their departing. Then, close to the hour of midnight, all the bronze gates of Sarnath burst open and emptied forth a frenzied throng that blackened the plain, so that all the visiting princes and travelers fled away in fright. For on the faces of this throng was writ a madness born of horror unendurable, and on their tongues were words so terrible that no hearer paused for proof. Men whose eyes were wild with fear shrieked aloud of the sight within the king's banquet hall, and where through the windows were seen no longer the forms of Nargis High and his nobles and slaves, but a horde of indescribable green voiceless things with bulging eyes, pouting flabby lips and curious ears, things which danced horribly, bearing in their paws golden platters set with rubies and diamonds containing uncouth flames. And the princes and travelers, as they fled from the domed city of Sarnath on horses and camels and elephants, looked again upon the mist-begetting lake and saw the gray rock Akurion was quite submerged. Through all the land of Benar and the lands adjacent spread the tales of those who had fled from Sarnath, and caravans sought that accursed city and its precious metals no more. It was long ere any traveler went thither, and even then only the brave and adventurous young men of distant Thelona dared make the journey. Adventurous young men of yellow hair and blue eyes, who are no kin to the men of Benar. These men indeed went to the lake to view Sarnath, but though they found the vast still lake itself, and the grey rock Curion, which rears high above it near the shore, they beheld not the wonder of the world and pride of all mankind, where once had risen walls of 300 cubits and towers yet higher, now stretched only the marshy shore, and where once had dwelt 50 millions of men, now crawled only the detestable green water lizard. Not even the mines of precious metal remained, for doom had come to Sarnath. But half buried in the rushes was spied a curious green idol of stone, an exceedingly ancient idol coated with seaweed and chiseled in the likeness of Bakrug, the great water lizard. That idol, enshrined in the high temple at Elarnek, was subsequently worshipped beneath the gibbous moon throughout the land of Manar. Okay, so that is the first reading. The next one we have is The Music of Eric Zahn. So let me get the share screen up here. Okay, we're going to zoom this in. I have examined maps of the city with the greatest care, yet have never again found the Rue d'Ayel. These maps have not been modern maps alone, for I know that names change. I have, on the contrary, delved deeply into all the antiques of the place, and have personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street name as the Rue d'Ayel. But despite all I have done, it remains an humiliating fact that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the locality where, during the last months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Eric Zahn. That my memory is broken, I do not wonder, for my health, physical and mental, was gravely disturbed throughout the period of my residence in the Rue d'Ayel. And I recall that I took none of my few acquaintances there. But that I cannot find the place again is both singular and perplexing, for it was within a half-hour's walk of the university, and was distinguished by peculiarities which could hardly be forgotten by anyone who had been there. I have never met a person who has seen the Rue d'Ayel. The Rue d'Ayel lay across a dark river, bordered by a precipitous brick, blear-windowed warehouses, and spanned by a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, as if the smoke of neighboring factories shut out the sun perpetually. The river was also odorous with evil stenches, which I have never smelled elsewhere, and which may someday help me to find it, since I could recognize them at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, first gradual, but incredibly steep as the Rue d'Ayel was reached. I have never seen another street as narrow and steep as the Rue d'Ayel. It was also almost a cliff, closed to all vehicles, consisting in several places of flights of steps, and ending at the top in a lofty ivied wall. Its paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, sometimes cobblestones, and sometimes bare earth with struggling greenish-gray vegetation. The houses were tall, peak-roofed, incredibly old, and crazily leaning backward, forward, and sideways. Occasionally, an opposite pair, both leaning forward, almost went across the street like an arch, and certainly they kept most of the light from the ground below. There were a few overhead bridges from house to house across the street. The inhabitants of that street impressed me peculiarly. At first, I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but later decided it was because they were all very old. I do not know how I came to live on such a street, but I was not myself when I moved there. I had been living in many poor places, always evicted for want of money, until at last I came upon that tottering house in the Rue d'Ayel, kept by the paralytic Blandot. It was the third house from the top of the street, by far the tallest from them all. My room was on the 5th story, the only inhabited room there, since the house was almost empty. On the night I arrived, I heard strange music from the peaked garret overhead, and the next day asked old Blandot about it. He told me it was an old German viol player, a strange, dumb man who signed his name as Eric Zahn. And he played evenings in a cheap theater orchestra, adding that Zahn's desire to play in the night after his return from the theater was the reason he had chosen this lofty and isolated garret room whose single gable window was the only point on the street from which one could look over the terminating wall at the declivity and panorama beyond. Thereafter, I heard Zahn every night, and although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. Knowing little of the art myself, I was yet certain that none of his harmonies had any relation to music I had heard before, and concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. The longer I listened, the more I was fascinated, until after a week I resolved to make the old man's acquaintance. One night, as he was returning from his work, I intercepted Zahn in the hallway and told him that I would like to know him and be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent person with shabby clothes, blue eyes, grotesque, satyr-like face, and nearly bald head, and at my first words seemed both angered and frightened. My obvious friendliness, however, finally melted him, and he grudgingly motioned to me to follow him up the dark, creaking, and rickety attic stairs. His room, 1 or 2 in the steeply pitched garret, was on the west side, towards the high wall that formed the upper end of the street. Its size was very great, and seemed the greater because of its extraordinary barrenness and neglect. Of furniture, there was only a narrow iron bedstead, a dingy washstand, a small table, a large bookcase, an iron music rack, and 3 old-fashioned chairs. Sheets of music were piled in disorder about the floor. The walls were of bare boards and had probably never known plaster, whilst the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem more deserted than inhabited. Evidently, Erich Zahn's world of beauty lay in some far cosmos of the imagination. Motioning me to sit still, the dumb man closed the door, turned the large wooden bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one he had brought with him. He now removed his vial from its moth-eaten covering, and taking it, seated himself in the least uncomfortable of the chairs. He did not employ the music rack, but offering no choice, and playing from memory, enchanted me for an hour with strains I had never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. To describe the exact nature is impossible for one unversed in music. They were a kind of fugue, with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality, but to me were notable for the absence of any of the weird notes I had overheard from my room below on other occasions. Those haunting notes I had remembered, and had often hummed and whistled inaccurately to myself. So when the player at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them. As I began my request, the wrinkled, satyr-like face lost the bored placidity it had possessed during the playing, and seemed to shew the same curious mixture of anger and fright which I had noticed when I first accosted the old man. For a moment I was inclined to use persuasion, regarding rather lightly the whims of senility, and even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains to which I had listened the night before. But I did not pursue this course for more than a moment, for when the dumb musician recognized the whistled air, his face grew suddenly distorted with an expression wholly beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand reached out to stop my mouth and silence the crude imitation. As he did this, he further demonstrated his eccentricity by casting a single startled glance toward the lone curtained window, as if he feared of some intruder. A glance doubly absurd, since the garret stood high and inaccessible above all the adjacent roofs, this window being the only point on the steep street, as the concierge had told me, from which one could see over the wall at the summit. The old man's glance brought Blandot's remark to my mind, and with a certain capriciousness I felt a wish to look out over the wide and dizzying panorama of moonlit roofs and city lights beyond the hilltop, which of all the dwellers in the Rue d'Aille only this crabbed musician could see. I moved towards the window and would have drawn aside the nondescript curtains, when with a frightened rage even greater than before, the dumb lodger was upon me again, this time motioning with his hand towards the door as he nervously strove to drag me thither with both hands. Now thoroughly disgusted with my host, I ordered him to release me and told him I would go at once. His clutch relaxed, and as he saw my disgust and offense, his own anger seemed to subside. He tightened his relaxing grip, but this time in a friendly manner, forcing me into a chair. Then, with an appearance of wistfulness, crossing to the littered table, where he wrote many words with a pencil in the labored French of a foreigner, The note which he finally handed me was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. Zahn said that he was old, lonely, and afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music and with other things. He had enjoyed my listening to his music and wished I would come again and not mind his eccentricities. But he could not play to another his weird harmonies, and could not bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He had not known until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing in my room, and now asked me if I would arrange with Blandot to take a lower room where I could not hear him in the night. He would, he wrote, defray the difference in rent. As I sat deciphering the inexorable French, I felt more lenient towards the old man. He was a victim of physical and nervous suffering, as I was, and my metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In the silence there came a slight sound from the window, and the shutter must have rattled in the night wind, and for some reason I started almost as violently as did Eric Zahn. So when I had finished reading, I shook my host by the hand and departed as a friend. The next day, Blandot gave me a more expensive room on the third floor because the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of respectable upholsterer. There was no one on the fourth floor. It was not long before I found that Zahn's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed while he was persuading me to move down from the fifth story. He did not ask me to call on him, and when I did call, he appeared uneasy and played listlessly. This was always at night. In the day he slept and would admit no one. My liking for him did not grow, though the attic room and the weird music seemed to hold an odd fascination for me. I had a curious desire to look out that window over the wall and down the unstained slopes of the glittering roofs and spires which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during the theater hours when Zahn was away, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing was to overhear the nocturnal playing of the dumb old man. At first I would tiptoe up to my old fifth floor, then I grew bold enough to climb the last creaking staircase to the peaked garret. There in the narrow hall outside the bolted door with a carved keyhole, I often heard sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread, the dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It was not that the sounds were hideous, for they were not, but that they held vibrations suggesting nothing of this globe of earth, and that at certain intervals they assumed a symphonic quality which I could hardly conceive as produced by one player. Certainly Eric Zahn was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder, whilst the old musician acquired an increasingly haggard and furtiveness pitiful to behold. He now refused to admit me at any time, and shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. Then, one night, as I listened at the door, I heard the shrieking viol swell into a chaotic babble of sound, a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own shaking sanity, had there not come from behind that battered portal a piteous proof that the horror was real. The awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute could utter, and which rises only in moments of the most terrible fear of anguish. I knocked repeatedly at the door, but received no response. Afterward, I waited in the black hallway, shivering with cold and fear, till I heard the poor musician's feeble effort to rise from the floor by the aid of a chair. Believing him just conscious after a fainting fit, I renewed my rapping at the same time, calling out my name reassuringly. I heard Zahn stumble to the window and close both shutter and sash, then stumble to the door, which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. This time his delight at having me present was real, for his distorted face gleamed with relief while he clutched at my coat as a child clutches at its mother's skirts. Shaking pathetically, the old man forced me into a chair whilst he sank into another, beside which his viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. He sat for some time inactive, nodding oddly, but having a paradoxical suggestion of intense and frightened listening. Subsequently, he seemed to be satisfied, and crossed to a chair by the table, wrote a brief note, handed it to me, and returned to the table, where he began to write rapidly and incessantly. The note implored me in the name of mercy and for the sake of my own curiosity to wait where I was while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later, while I still waited, and while the old musician's feverishly written sheets all continued to pile up, that I saw Zahn start as from the hint of a horrible shock. Unmistakably, he was looking at the curtained window and listening shudderingly. Then I half fancied I heard a sound myself. though it was not horrible sound, but rather an exquisitely low and infinitely distant musical note, suggesting a player in one of the neighboring houses, or in some abode beyond the lofty wall over which I had never been able to look. Upon Zahn, the effort was terrible, for dropping his pencil, suddenly he rose, seizing his viol, and commenced to rend the night with the wildest playing I had ever heard from his bow, save when listening at the barred door. It would be useless to describe the playing of Eric Zahn on that dreadful night. It was more horrible than anything I had ever overheard, because I could now see the expression on his face, and could realize at this time the motive was stark fear. He was trying to make a noise, to ward something off or drown something out. What I could not imagine. Awesome though I felt it must be. The playing grew fantastic, delirious, and hysterical. Yet to the last, the qualities of supreme genius which I knew the strange old man possessed. I recognized the air. It was a wild Hungarian dance popular in the theaters, and I reflected for a moment that this was the first time I had ever heard Zahn play the work of another composer. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder, mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. The player was dripping with an uncanny perspiration and twisted like a monkey, always looking frantically at the curtain window. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through the seething abyss of clouds and smoke and lightning, and then I thought I heard a shriller, steadier tone that was not from the viol. A calm, deliberate, purposeful mocking note from far away in the west. At this juncture, the shutter began to rattle in a howling night wind, which had sprung up outside as if in answer to the mad playing within. Zahn's screaming viol now outdid itself, emitting sounds I had never thought a viol could emit. The shutter rattled more loudly, unfastened, and commenced slamming against the window. Then the glasses broke shiveringly under the persistent impacts, and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zahn had begun to write out his horrible secret. I looked at Zahn and saw that he was past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging, glassy, and sightless, and the frantic playing had become blind, mechanical, unrecognizable orgy that no pen could even suggest. A sudden gust, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and bore it toward the window. I followed the flying sheets in desperation, but they were gone before I reached the demolished panes. Then I remembered my old wish to gaze from this window, the only window in the Rue de Yael, from which one might see the slope beyond the wall and the city outspread beneath. It was very dark, but the city's lights always burned, and I expected to see them there amidst the rain and wind. Yet when I looked from the highest of the gable windows, looked while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below, and no friendly lights gleaming from remembered streets, but only the blackness of space illimitable, unimagined space, alive and with motion and music, and having no semblance to anything on earth. And as I stood there looking in terror, the wind blew out both candles in that ancient peak garret, leaving me in savage and impenetrable darkness with chaos and pandemonium before me, and the demon madness of that night-bang viol behind me. I staggered back in the dark, without the means of striking a light, crashing against the table, overturning a chair, and finally groping my way to the place where the blackness screamed with shocking music. To save myself and Eric Zahn, I could at least try, whatever the powers opposed to me. Once, I thought, some chill thing brushed me, and I screamed. My scream could not be heard above that hideous viol. Suddenly, out of the blackness, the madly sawing bow struck me, and I knew I was close to the player. I felt a head touch the back of Zahn's chair, and then found and shook his shoulder in an effort to bring him to his senses. He did not respond, and still the viol shrieked, or without slacking. I moved my head to his head, whose mechanical nodding I was able to stop, and shouted in his ear that we must both flee from the unknown things of the night. But he neither answered me nor abated the frenzy of his unutterable music, while all through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness and babble. When my hand touched his ear, I shuddered, though I knew not why. I felt of the still face, the ice-cold, stiffened, unbreathing face whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void. And then by some miracle, finding the door and the large wooden bolt, I plunged wildly away from that glassy-eyed thing in the dark, and from the ghoulish howling of that accursed viol whose fury increased even as I plunged. Leaping, floating, flying down these endless stairs, through the dark house, racing mindlessly out into the narrow, steep, and ancient street of steps and tottering houses, clattering down steps and over cobblestones to the lower streets and the putrid canyon-walled river, panting across the great dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards we know. All these are terrible impressions that linger with me, and I recall that there was no wind, and that the moon was out, and that all the lights of the city twinkled. Despite my most careful searches and investigations, I have never since been able to find the Rue de Yale, but I am not wholly sorry either for this or for the loss and undreamable abysses of the closely written sheets which alone could have explained the music of Eric Zahn. All right. Now we are going to do the next one. We have Dagon. Let's go ahead and share screen. Dagon. Yeah, okay, it's working. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. But do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due to us as naval prisoners. So liberal indeed was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or seacoast was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for the uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and other less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing and nothing in sight save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unexpected volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for a traveling purpose in a short time. That night I slept very little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight and evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still traveled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I first espied it. By the fourth evening I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror and curious reminiscences of paradise lost, and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst others, after a drop of a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. At once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself. But I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping at my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting, for the most part, of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was a pictorial carving, however, that did the most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of the enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Dore. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least, a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shewn disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shewn in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestors of the Piltdown Neanderthal was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring archaeologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly I saw it, with only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface. The thing slid into view above the dark water, vast, Polyphemus-like and loathing. It darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm sometime after where I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god, but soon perceived that he was hopelessly conventional. I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account of the information of the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. After I ask myself if I could not have all been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the ocean boat after my escape from the German man of war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and carving their own detestable likeness on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down on their reeking talons the remnants of puny war-exhausted mankind, of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door. As of some immense slobbering body lumbering against it, it shall not find me. That hand, the window, the window. All right, everybody. Let's see. We might have room for one more. Let's see. Polaris. Let's see if we can find Polaris. Yeah, well, I think we can do Polaris. And then Yep, this will be the last one. Polaris. Into the north window of my chamber glows the pole star with uncanny lights. All through the long hellish hours of blackness it shines there. And in the autumn of the year, when the winds from the north curse and whine, and the red-leaved trees of the swamp mutter things to one another, in the small hours of the morning under the horn-waning moon, I sit by the casement and watch that star. Down from the heights reels the glittering Cassiopeia as the hours wear on, while Charles Wayne lumbers up from behind the vapor-soaked swamp trees that sway in the night wind. Just before dawn, Arcturus winks royally from above the cemetery on the low hillock, and Coma Bernice's shimmers widely afar off in the mysterious east, but still the pole star leers down from the same place in the black vault, winking hideously like an insane watching eye which strives to convey some strange message, yet recalls nothing save that it once had a message to convey. Sometimes when it is cloudy I can sleep. Well do I remember the night of the great aurora, when over the swamp played the shocking coruscations of the demon light. After the beams came clouds, and then I slept. And it was under a horn waning moon that I saw the city for the first time. Still and somnolent did it lie, on a strange plateau in a hollow betwixt strange peaks. Of ghastly marble were its walls and its towers, its columns, domes, and pavements. In the marble streets were marble pillars, the upper parts of which were carven into the images of grave bearded men. The air was warm and stirred not, and overhead, scarce 10 degrees from the zenith, glowed that watching pole star. Long did I gaze on the city, but the day came not. When the red Aldebaran, which blinked low in the sky but never set, had crawled a quarter of the way around the horizon, I saw light and motion in the houses and the streets. Forms strangely robed, but at once noble and familiar, walked abroad, and under the horned waning moon men talked wisdom in a tongue which I understood, though it was unlike any language I had ever known. And when the red Aldebaran had crawled more than halfway around the horizon, there were again darkness and silence. When I awaked, I was not as I had been. Upon my memory was graven the vision of the city, and within my soul had arisen another and vaguer recollection, of whose nature was not then certain. Thereafter, on the cloudy nights when I could sleep, I saw the city often, sometimes under that horned waning moon, and sometimes under the hot yellow rays of a sun which did not set, but which wheeled low around the horizon, and on the clear nights the pole star leered as never before. Gradually I came to wonder what might be my place in that city on the strange plateau betwixt strange peaks. At first content to view the scene as an all-observant, uncorporeal presence, I now desired to define my relation to it, and to speak my mind among the grave men who conversed each day in the public squares. I said to myself, this is no dream, for by what means can I prove the greater reality of that other life in the house of stone and brick south of the sinister swamps and the cemetery on the low hillock where the pole star peers into my north window each night? One night, as I listened to the discourse in the large square containing many statues, I felt a change and perceived that I had at last a bodily form. Nor was I a stranger in the streets of Alathoe, which lies on the plateau of Sarkis, betwixt the peaks Doton and Kaidafanek. It was my friend Alos who spoke, and his speech was one that pleased my soul, for it was the speech of a true man and patriot. That night had the news come of Dicos' fall, and of the advance of the Inutos, squat, hellish, yellow fiends, who 5 years ago had appeared out of the unknown west to ravage the confines of our kingdom, and finally to besiege our towns. Having taken the fortified places at the foot of the mountains, their way now lay open to the plateau, unless every citizen could resist with strength of 10 men. For the squat creatures were mighty in the arts of war, and knew not the scruples of honor which held back our tall, gray-eyed men of Lomar from ruthless conquest. Alos, my friend, was commander of all the forces on the plateau, and in him lay the last hope of our country. On this occasion, he spoke of the perils to be faced and exhorted the men of Alothe, bravest of the Lomarians, to sustain the traditions of their ancestors, who, when forced to move southward from Zabna before the advance of the great ice sheet, even as our descendants must someday flee from the land of Lomar, valiantly and victoriously swept aside the hairy, long-armed cannibal Ganofniks that stood in their way. To me, Alios denied a warrior's part, for I was feeble and given to strange faintings when subjected to stress and hardships. But my eyes were the keenest in the city, despite the long hours I gave each day to the study of the Nakadic manuscripts and the wisdom of the Zabnarian fathers. So my friend, desiring not to doom me to inaction, rewarded me with that duty which was second to nothing in importance. To the watchtower of Thapanen he sent me, there to serve as the eyes of our army, should the Inutos attempt to gain the citadel by the narrow pass behind the peak Noton. and thus surprise the garrison. I was to give the signal fire which would warn the waiting soldiers and save the town from immediate disaster. Alone I mounted the tower, for every man of stout body was needed in the passes below. My brain was sore dazed with excitement and fatigue, for I had not slept in many days, yet was my purpose firm, for I loved my native land of Lomar and the marbled city of Alathaway that lies betwixt the peaks of Noton and Cadathonek. But as I stood in the tower's topmost chamber, I beheld the horned waning moon, red and sinister, quivering through the vapors that hovered over the distant valley of Banaf. And through an opening in the roof glittered the pale pole star, fluttering as if alive, and leering like a fiend and a tempter. Methought its spirit whispered evil counsel, soothing me to traitorous somnolence with a damnable rhythmic promise, which it repeated over and over. Slumber watcher till the spheres 26,000 years have revolved, and I return to the spot where I now burn. Other stars anon shall rise to the axis of the skies, stars that soothe and stars that bless with a sweet forgetfulness. Only when my round is o'er shall thy past disturb thy door. Vainly did I struggle with my drowsiness, seeking to connect these strange words with some lore of the skies which I had learnt from the Draconic manuscripts. My head heavy and reeling drooped to my breast, and when next I looked up, it was in a dream, with the pole star grinning at me through a window from over the horrible swaying trees of a dream swamp. And I am still dreaming. In my shame and despair, I sometimes scream frantically, begging the dream creatures around me to waken me ere the Etunos steal up the pass behind the peak Noton and take the citadel by surprise. But these creatures are demons, for they laugh at me and tell me that I am not dreaming. They mock me whilst I sleep, and whilst they squat, yellow foe may be creeping silently upon us. I have failed in my duty and betrayed the marbled city of Alathaway. I have proved false to Alos, my friend and commander, but still these shadows of my dream deride me. They say there is no land of Lomar, save in the nocturnal imaginings, that in the realms where the pole star shines high and red, Aldebaran crawls low around the horizon. There has been naught save ice and snow for thousands of years, and never a man save squat yellow figures blighted by the cold whom they call Esquimaux. And as I writhe in my guilty agony, frantic to save the city whose peril every moment grows, and vainly striving to shake off this unnatural dream of a house of stone and brick, south of a sinister swamp and a cemetery on a low hillock, the pole star, evil and monstrous, leers down from the black vault, winking hideously like an insane watching eye, which strives to convey some strange message, yet recalls nothing, save it once had a message to convey. All right, so that is all we got. We have... Oh, somebody wants the little black cat. Do you mean... Oh, let's see here. The Cats of Uthar? Yeah, we need the Cats of Uthar. Yeah. All right, so I guess I am taking favorites now, guys. I'm going to read the Cats of Uthar. The Cats of Uthar. It is said that in Uthar... Whoops. Let me reload this page. There's a little error here. Okay. Let's make sure it works. Okay. It is said that in Uthar, which lies beyond the river sky, no man may kill a cat. And this I can verily believe as I gaze upon him who sitteth purring before the fire. For the cat is cryptic, and close to strange things which men cannot see. He is the soul of antique Egyptus, and bearer of tales from forgotten cities in Meroe and Ophir. He is the kin of the jungle lords, an heir to the secrets of hoary and sinister Africa. The Sphinx is his cousin, and he speaks her language. But he is more ancient than the Sphinx, and remembers that which she hath forgotten. And Ulfar, before ever the burgesses forbade the killing of cats, there dwelt an old cotter and his wife, who delight to trap and slay the cats of their neighbors. Why they did this I do not know, save they may hate the voice of a cat in the night, and take it ill that cats should run stealthily about yards and gardens at twilight. But whatever the reason, this old man and woman took pleasure in trapping and slaying every cat which came near to their hovel. And from some of the sounds heard after dark, many villagers fancied that the manner of the slaying was exceedingly peculiar. But the villagers did not discuss such things with the old man and his wife because of the habitual expression on the withered faces of the two, and because their cottage was so small and so darkly hidden under spreading oaks at the back of a neglected yard. In truth, much as the owners of cats hated these odd folk, they feared them more, and instead of berating them as brutal assassins, merely took care that no cherished pet or mouser should stray towards the remote hovel under the dark trees. When through some unavoidable oversight a cat was missed and sounds heard after dark, the loser would lament impotently, or console himself by thanking fate that it was not one of his children who had thus vanished. For the people of Ulthar were simple, and knew not whence it all cats first came. One day a caravan of strange wanderers from the south entered the narrow cobbled streets of Ulthar. Dark wanderers they were, and unlike the other roving folk who passed through the village twice every year, in the marketplace they told fortunes for silver and bought gray beads from the merchants. What was the land of these wanderers none could tell, but it was seen that they were given to strange prayers, and that they had painted on their sides of their wagons strange figures with human bodies and the heads of cats, hawks, rams, and lions. And the leader of the caravan wore a headdress with 2 horns and a curious disc betwixt the horns. There was in this singular caravan a little boy with no father or mother, but only a tiny black kitten to cherish. The plague had not been kind to him, yet had left him this small furry thing to mitigate his sorrow. And when one is very young, one can find great relief in the lively antics of a black kitten. So the boy, whom the people called Minas, smiled more than he wept, as he sat playing with his graceful kitten on the steps of an oddly painted wagon. On the 3rd morning of the wanderer's stay on Ulthar, Minas could not find his kitten. And as he sobbed aloud in the marketplace, certain villagers told him of the old man and his wife, and of the sounds heard in the night. And when he heard these things, his sobbing gave place to meditation, and finally to prayer. He stretched out his arms toward the sun, and prayed in a tongue no villager could understand. Though indeed the villagers did not try very hard to understand, since their attention was mostly taken up by the sky and the odd shapes the clouds were assuming. It was very peculiar, but as the little boy uttered his petition, there seemed to form overhead the shadowy nebulous figures of exotic things, of hybrid creatures crowned with horned flanked discs. Nature is full of such illusions to impress the imagination. That night the wanderers left Ulthar and were never seen again. And the householders were troubled when they noticed that in all the village there was not a cat to be found. From each hearth the familiar cat had vanished, cats large and small, black, gray, striped, yellow, and white. Old Cranon, the burgomaster, swore that the dark folk had taken the cats away in revenge for the killing of Mena's kitten, and cursed the caravan and the little boy. But Nith, the lean notary, declared that the old cotter and his wife were more likely persons to suspect, for their hatred of cats was notorious and increasingly bold. Still, no one durst complain of the sinister couple, even when little Atal, the innkeeper's son, vowed that he had at twilight seen all the cows of Ulthar in that accursed yard under the trees, pacing very slowly and solemnly in a circle around the cottage, 2 abreast, as if in performance of some unheard-of rite of beasts. The villagers did not know how much to believe from so small a boy, and though they feared that the evil pair had charmed the cats to their death, they preferred not to chide the old cotter till they met him outside his dark and repellent yard. So Ulthar went to sleep in vain anger, and when the people awaked at dawn, behold, every cat was back at his accustomed hearth, large and small, black, gray, striped, yellow, and white. None was missing. Very sleek and fat did the cats appear, and sonorous with purring content. The citizens talked with one another of the affair, and marveled not a little. Old Cranon again insisted that it was the dark folk who had taken them, since the cats did not return alive from the cottage of the ancient man and his wife. But all agreed on one thing, that the refusal of all the cats to eat their portion of meat or drink their saucers of milk was exceedingly curious, as for 2 whole days the sleek, lazy cats of Ulthar would touch no food, but dozed by the fire or the sun. It was a week before the villagers noticed that no lights were appearing at dusk in the windows of the cottage under the trees. Then the lean Nith remarked that no one had seen the old man or his wife since the night the cats were away. In another week, the burgomaster decided to overcome his fears and call at the strangely silent dwelling as a matter of duty. Though in so doing, he was careful to take with him Shang the blacksmith and Thule the cutter of stone as witnesses. And when they had broken down the frail door, they found only this: 2 cleanly picked human skeletons on the earthen floor, and a number of singular beetles crawling in the shadowy corners. There was subsequently much talk among the burgesses of Ulfar. Zath, the coroner, disputed at length with Nith, the lean notary, and Cranon and Shang and Thule are overwhelmed with questions. Even little Atal, the innkeeper's son, was closely questioned and given a sweetmeat as reward. They talked of the old cotter and his wife, of the caravan of dark wanderers, a small Menes and his black kitten, of the prayer of Menes, and of the sky during the prayer, of the doings of the cats on the night the caravan left, and of what was later found in the cottage and the dark tree in the repellent yard. And in the end, the burgesses passed that remarkable law, which is told of by traders in Hatheg and discussed by travelers in Nir, namely that in Ulfar no man may kill a cat. All right. Well, that concludes tonight's Halloween reading. I ended up reading 5 Lovecraft stories, which that's always fun to do. It's Todd Lewis, the Price of Fly podcast, signing off.